The rain had stopped hours ago, but the smell of wet earth still clung to the air outside the grand ballroom of the Eco Pearl Hotel in Victoria Island, Lagos. Inside, under chandeliers that sparkled like captured stars, Ayo Okafor stood near the entrance in a perfectly tailored navy suit, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, his watch glinting gold under the warm lights. He was 32 years old, lean and tall, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that had learned to hide their origins. Tonight was supposed to be perfect. Tonight was supposed to be the night that proved he had finally made it, that he had climbed out of the red dust of his village and planted his flag among the elite of Lagos. Tonight was Thanksgiving dinner, and he had spared no expense. The tables were draped in white silk, the centerpieces were imported orchids, and the waiters moved like shadows in their crisp uniforms. Everything was curated, everything was intentional, everything was designed to impress. Especially his in-laws. Ayo's wife, Amara, stood beside him in a gold evening gown that hugged her curves and caught the light with every breath. She was beautiful in the way that turned heads, with smooth skin the color of polished mahogany and eyes that sparkled with excitement. She had grown up in Ikoyi, in a mansion with a fountain in the courtyard and housekeepers who served breakfast on fine china. Her father was a retired bank executive, her mother a socialite who lunched with senators' wives. Amara had never known hunger, never known what it meant to sleep on a mat because there was no bed, never known the shame of wearing the same uniform to school for 3 years because there was no money for another. And Ayo had spent the last 5 years of their marriage making sure she never had to know, making sure no one ever had to know where he had come from. He had built his software company from nothing, working 18-hour days, sleeping in the office, living on Gary and groundnuts until the first contract came through, then the second, then the 10th. Then suddenly he was signing deals with banks and telecoms, hiring staff, moving into a glass office building in Lekki, buying the kind of cars that made people stop and stare. He had become the man he had always dreamed of being, wealthy, respected, untouchable. And tonight, with Amara's parents coming to dinner along with her aunts and uncles and cousins, he wanted to show them that their daughter had not married beneath her station. He wanted to prove that he belonged in their world now, that he was no longer the village boy who had shown up to their family introduction ceremony 5 years ago with nervous hands and borrowed shoes. But then his own parents had arrived. Ayo had seen them walk through the hotel's glass doors just as the sun was setting, and his stomach had clenched. His father, Papa Okafor, was a small man with shoulders bent from decades of farming, his hands calloused and rough, his skin darkened by years under the sun. He wore a faded brown kaftan that Ayo recognized from 10 years ago, the embroidery at the collar worn thin, the fabric wrinkled despite what must have been his mother's best efforts to iron it. His mother, Mama Okafor, walked beside him in a plain blue wrapper and blouse, her headscarf tied simply, her feet in old leather sandals that had been resoled more times than Ayo could count. She carried a small bag woven from raffia, the kind village women used to carry yams to market. They looked exactly like what they were, humble farmers from a small village in Enugu state, people who had never set foot in a 5-star hotel before, people who did not belong in a room filled with Lagos elite. Ayo's first instinct had been shame, hot and choking, rising up his throat like bile. He had invited them, yes, sent them money for transport, told them to come and celebrate Thanksgiving with him and Amara, but he had not expected them to look so rural, so out of place, so visibly poor. He had imagined them somehow transformed by the occasion, magically elevated by the importance of the event. Instead, they looked lost, his father squinting under the bright lights, his mother clutching her raffia bag like a lifeline as they stood near the entrance, unsure of where to go. Amara had noticed them too. She had glanced at Ayo with a question in her eyes, but she said nothing. She was too polite for that, too well-bred to voice the discomfort that flickered across her face. But Ayo had seen it. And worse, he had seen Amara's mother, Mrs. Nwasu, arrive moments later in a silver Mercedes, stepping out in a beaded gown and heels that clicked like authority on the marble floor. She had swept into the ballroom with her husband and their extended family, all of them dressed in expensive fabrics and jewelry that caught the light, all of them moving with the ease of people who had always had money, who had always belonged in rooms like this. And when Mrs. Nwasu's eyes had landed on Ayo's parents standing awkwardly near the door, her smile had thinned, just slightly, just enough for Ayo to notice. That was when he made the decision. He told himself it was practical. He told himself it was about seating arrangements, about making sure everyone was comfortable. The ballroom had been set up with a large VIP table at the center, directly under the main chandelier, with plush chairs and the best view of the room. That table was meant for the people who mattered most, the people who needed to be honored. And then there were smaller tables arranged around the edges, simple and functional, meant for overflow guests and staff. Io had originally planned to seat everyone together, one big blended family, but now, looking at his parents in their village clothes and his in-laws in their designer attire, he knew that would be a mistake. It would be awkward. It would highlight the differences. It would make everyone uncomfortable. So he approached his parents with a smile that felt like glass in his mouth, and he told them gently that they would be sitting at a different table, just for tonight, just to make things easier. His father had nodded slowly, confusion in his eyes, but trust still there, always there, the kind of trust that comes from a lifetime of believing your child knows best. His mother had touched his arm, her fingers soft and worn, and she had said, "It is okay, my son. We are just happy to be here." And Io had felt something twist inside him, something that might have been guilt, but he had pushed it down and led them to a table near the back corner of the room, close to the service door where the waiters came in and out, close to the kitchen where the clatter of dishes could be heard, close to the generator outside that hummed and rattled and filled the air with the smell of diesel. The table was smaller than the others, and one of the chairs was broken, its legs shorter than the rest so that it wobbled when his mother sat down. His father tried to steady it with a folded napkin, his movements careful and patient, and Io watched for only a moment before turning away. He could not afford to think about it. He could not afford to feel. Tonight was about impressing the Enwosis, about securing his place in their world, about proving that he had made it. His parents would understand. They always understood. They had sacrificed everything for him, sent him to school when they could barely afford to eat, worked their fingers to the bone so he could have a future. Surely they would not begrudge him this one night. Surely they would see that he was doing this for all of them, to protect the life he had built, to keep the respect he had earned. But as Io returned to the VIP table and took his seat beside Amara, as he shook hands with her father and exchanged pleasantries with her mother, as he laughed at her uncle's jokes and poured wine into crystal glasses, he could not stop himself from glancing toward the back corner of the room. And every time he did, he saw his parents sitting there in the shadows, his mother's hands folded in her lap, his father's eyes watching him with something that looked like sadness. And Io told himself it was fine. It was just one night. It would be fine. He had no idea that a young waiter in a white uniform had already pulled out his phone, already taken a photograph of the broken table in the corner where two elderly villagers sat alone in the noise, and the shadows while their son laughed and drank at the center of the room, bathed in light and luxury. He had no idea that the photograph was already being uploaded, already being shared, already beginning to spread across Lagos like wildfire. The dinner began with a prayer led by Amara's father, Mr. Nwasu, his voice deep and authoritative as he blessed the food and thanked God for prosperity and family. Io bowed his head and closed his eyes, but his mind was elsewhere, tracking the movements in the room, calculating impressions, monitoring reactions. When the prayer ended and everyone sat down, the waiters began to serve, moving efficiently between tables with trays of jollof rice and fried rice, grilled chicken and peppered snail, moi and plantain, salads arranged like art on white porcelain plates. The VIP table received their dishes first, each plate carefully presented, each glass filled with chilled wine or fresh juice. Amara's mother complimented the presentation, her voice carrying that particular tone of approval that wealthy Lagos women used when they were genuinely impressed. Her father nodded and cut into his chicken with the silver cutlery, and Io felt a surge of relief wash through him. This was working. This was exactly what he had wanted. Across the table, Amara caught his eye and smiled, a small private smile that said she was proud of him, that she saw how hard he had worked to make this evening perfect. She reached under the table and squeezed his hand briefly, her fingers warm and soft, and for a moment Io felt the tension in his shoulders ease. Maybe he had made the right choice. Maybe his parents really were more comfortable at the smaller table, away from the formality and the scrutiny. Maybe this was kindness in its own way, sparing them the discomfort of sitting among people whose lives were so different from their own. He tried to believe this as he lifted his wine glass and joined in the toast that Amara's uncle was making, something about family and gratitude and the blessings of hard work. But then he heard it, a sharp metallic clang followed by a scraping sound, and then his mother's voice, soft and apologetic, saying something he could not quite make out. Io's head turned instinctively toward the back corner, and he saw that the broken chair had finally given way completely. His mother was half standing, trying to right herself, and his father was on his feet helping her, his movements careful and concerned. The chair lay on its side, one leg bent at an angle, and a waiter was rushing over to help, his face flushed with embarrassment. Several guests at nearby tables had turned to look, and Io felt heat crawl up his neck. He started to rise from his seat, an automatic response, but then Amara's mother said something about the orchids, and he was pulled back into the conversation at the VIP table, and by the time he looked again, his parents had been given a different chair and were sitting down once more, his mother smoothing her wrapper with shaking hands. Io told himself to go over there, told himself to check if they were all right, to make sure they had everything they needed. But Mr. Nwasu was asking him about his latest business contract, and this was important. This was the kind of conversation that could lead to connections and opportunities, so Io stayed in his seat and answered the questions, his voice steady and professional even as his mind kept drifting to that corner table where his parents sat in the shadow of the generator's hum. He would check on them later, after dinner, after he had secured the good impression he needed from his in-laws. There would be time. The meal continued, course after course, and the conversation at the VIP table flowed easily now, lubricated by wine and good food, and the comfortable rhythm of people who understood each other's world. Amara's cousins talked about their recent trip to Dubai. Her aunt discussed her daughter's admission to a university in London. Her uncle told a story about playing golf with a government minister. Io laughed at the right moments, nodded at the right times, contributed his own stories about business deals and networking events. He was performing, and he was performing well, and he could see in the approving glances from Amara's parents that he was succeeding. This was what integration looked like. This was what belonging felt like. He had earned his place at this table through years of relentless work and sacrifice, and he was not going to apologize for claiming it. But in the pauses between conversations, in the moments when he lifted his glass or cut his meat, Io's eyes would drift back to his parents. They were eating now, slowly and carefully, his mother's movements precise as if she were afraid of making a mess, his father chewing thoughtfully, both of them sitting upright despite the discomfort of their location. No one at the VIP table had acknowledged them. No one had gone over to greet them or welcome them or ask how they were enjoying the evening. They were invisible, two old villagers in the corner of a glittering room, and Io realized with a sick feeling in his stomach that he had made them invisible. He had chosen this. He had orchestrated their erasure from the celebration because their presence threatened the image he was trying to project. The young waiter who had photographed the broken table earlier was now standing near the service door, his phone hidden in his palm, his eyes moving between the VIP table and the corner table with an expression that Io could not quite read. There was something in the waiter's face, something sharp and assessing, but Io dismissed it. Staff always watched the guests. It was part of their job. There was nothing unusual about it. He turned his attention back to the conversation, back to the safety of the VIP table where everyone spoke his new language and understood his new life. Amara leaned close to him during dessert, her perfume sweet and expensive, and whispered, "Your parents look a bit lost over there. Should we invite them to join us?" Her voice was kind, genuinely concerned, and Io felt a flash of something that might have been gratitude or might have been panic. He glanced toward his parents again and saw that they had barely touched their dessert, their plates still full of the chocolate cake and fruit that the waiters had served. His mother's hands were folded in her lap again, her expression patient and resigned, and his father was looking at him across the room with eyes that held no anger, no resentment, only a deep and quiet sadness that cut through Io like a blade. "They're fine," Io heard himself say, his voice low and tight. "They prefer it there, less noise, more comfortable." The lie tasted like ash, but he forced himself to smile at Amara, to squeeze her hand reassuringly. "We'll spend time with them after dinner. Right now, let's just enjoy the evening." Amara studied his face for a moment, doubt flickering in her eyes, but then she nodded and turned back to her dessert, and Io released a breath he had not realized he was holding. He was doing this for her too, he told himself, for their marriage, for the life they were building together. If her parents saw him as an equal, if they respected him as one of their own, then everything would be easier. His parents would understand. They had always wanted the best for him. They had always encouraged him to rise. Surely this was what rising looked like. The evening was winding down now, guests beginning to stand and mingle, some moving toward the bar for after-dinner drinks, others gathering in small groups to talk and laugh. Io stood as well, intending finally to go to his parents, to check on them, to perhaps bring them into the main gathering. But before he could take more than 2 steps, Mr. Nwasu called him over to meet someone, a business associate who might be interested in partnering on a new project, and Io found himself pulled into another conversation, another performance, another opportunity that he could not afford to miss. He glanced over his shoulder toward the corner table and saw that his parents were still sitting there, waiting patiently, his mother's hands folded, his father's eyes watching him with that same quiet sadness. And in that moment, as Io shook hands with the business associate and listened to talk of investments and returns, he felt something crack inside him, some small fissure in the foundation of the life he had built. But he pushed it down, buried it deep, told himself it was nothing. Tonight had been a success. His in-laws were impressed. His reputation was secure. That was what mattered. That was what he had worked for. His parents would forgive him. They always did. That was what parents did. What Io did not know, what he could not have known as he stood there in his expensive suit under the glittering chandeliers, was that the photograph taken by the young waiter had already been posted to Twitter with a caption that read, "This is what happens when you forget where you came from. Rich man seats his village parents by the generator while his in-laws get VIP treatment. Shame." The post had been shared 3 times in the first minute, 30 times in the first 5 minutes. By the time Io finally excused himself from the business conversation and turned to walk toward his parents, the photograph had been shared 300 times, and the comments were beginning to pour in like rain, each one sharper than the last, each one carrying the collective outrage of thousands of people who saw in that image everything that was wrong with the new Nigerian elite. The storm was coming, but Io, still smiling, still confident, still believing that he had controlled the narrative of the evening, did not yet feel the first drops. Io woke the next morning to the sound of his phone vibrating against the glass surface of his nightstand, a persistent buzzing that pulled him from sleep like a hand dragging him out of deep water. The bedroom was still dark, the curtains drawn against the early Lagos sun, and beside him Amara was sleeping peacefully, her breathing soft and even one arm tucked under her pillow. For a moment Io lay still, his body heavy with exhaustion from the previous night, his mind slowly climbing toward consciousness. The dinner had ended well, or so he had thought. His in-laws had left satisfied, his business contacts had been impressed, and he had finally managed to spend a few minutes with his parents before they departed in the taxi he had arranged for them. His mother had hugged him tightly, her small frame pressed against his chest, and she had whispered, "Thank you for inviting us, my son. We are so proud of you." His father had shaken his hand, his grip firm despite his age, and said nothing, only looked at him with those sad, knowing eyes that seemed to see through all of Io's carefully constructed walls. The phone continued to buzz, and Io reached for it with a groan, squinting at the screen in the darkness. 23 missed calls, 47 text messages, 62 WhatsApp notifications. His heart lurched in his chest, a sudden spike of adrenaline that burned away the last traces of sleep. Something was wrong, something had happened. His first thought was business, some crisis with a client or a server failure or a security breach. He unlocked the phone with trembling fingers and opened his messages, scanning through them with growing confusion. The texts were from friends, from colleagues, from people he had not spoken to in years. "Is this you?" one read. "What were you thinking?" said another. "You need to see Twitter," said a third. Io's stomach tightened, a cold knot forming just below his ribs. He opened Twitter, his hands suddenly clumsy, his breath coming faster. The photograph was the first thing he saw. It had been retweeted onto his timeline by someone he followed, and even in the small thumbnail image he recognized it immediately. The corner table, the broken chair lying on its side, his parents sitting in the shadows near the generator, his mother's raffia bag visible on the table, his father's worn kaftan unmistakable even in the dim light. And in the background, blurred but clearly visible, was the VIP table where Io himself could be seen laughing, his arm around Amara, a wine glass raised in his hand. The contrast was devastating. The caption read, "This is what happens when you forget where you came from. Rich man seats his village parents by the generator while his in-laws get VIP treatment. Shame." The tweet had been posted 8 hours ago, sometime during the dinner itself, and it now had over 50,000 retweets and hundreds of thousands of likes. The comments beneath it stretched on endlessly, a cascading wall of anger and disgust and moral outrage. Io's vision blurred as he scrolled through them, each comment landing like a physical blow. "This is disgusting," one read. "Imagine working your whole life to send your child to school and this is how he treats you," said another. "Name and shame this man. Let everyone know who he is," demanded a third. And then further down, someone had identified him. "That's Io Okafor, CEO of TechBridge Solutions. His company is in Lekki." The tweet had been retweeted 2,000 times. Someone else had posted a screenshot of his LinkedIn profile. Another had shared a photo from his company website, Within hours, his identity had been spread across Nigerian Twitter like wildfire, and the outrage had found its target. Boycott his company, the tweets urged. Cancel all contracts with TechBridge. Let him lose everything just like he humiliated his parents. The words swam before Io's eyes, and he felt his hands begin to shake, the phone nearly slipping from his grip. He sat up in bed, his heart hammering against his ribs, his mouth dry as dust. This could not be happening. This could not be real. It was just a dinner, just a seating arrangement, just a practical decision to keep everyone comfortable. How had it become this? How had a single photograph turned into a national scandal? He opened Instagram and found the same image posted there, shared thousands of times, the comments equally brutal. He checked Facebook and saw it spreading through groups and pages, each post accompanied by think pieces about class warfare and the corruption of African values and the death of filial piety. Bloggers had already written articles with headlines like, "When Success Makes You Forget Your Parents," and "The Dark Side of Nigeria's New Money Elite." His name was everywhere, his face attached to every story, his reputation being torn apart in real time by millions of people who had never met him, but who had already decided what kind of man he was. Io stumbled out of bed, his legs weak beneath him, and walked to the bathroom on instinct, needing to move, needing to do something with the panic that was rising in his throat like vomit. He turned on the light and stared at himself in the mirror, at his own face pale and drawn, his eyes wide with something close to terror. Who had taken that photograph? Who had posted it? He tried to remember the evening, tried to recall if he had seen anyone with a phone pointed in that direction, but the night was a blur of faces and conversations and wine-soaked laughter. It could have been anyone, a guest, a waiter, someone passing by. It did not matter now. The damage was done, and it was spreading faster than he could comprehend, moving through the digital landscape like a plague, infecting every platform, every conversation, every space where Nigerians gathered online to judge and discuss and condemn. His phone rang, the sound sharp and jarring in the quiet bathroom, and Io answered without thinking, his voice hoarse. "Hello." It was Chidi, his business partner, and the man sounded frantic, words tumbling over each other in a rush. "Io, what the hell is going on? Have you seen Twitter? Have you seen what people are saying? Our company email is flooded with complaints. 3 clients have already sent messages saying they want to terminate their contracts. The phone has been ringing nonstop since 6 a.m. You need to do something. You need to fix this." Io opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. What could he say? How could he explain? How could he make anyone understand that he had not meant to humiliate his parents, that he had only been trying to navigate an impossible situation, that he had been caught between 2 worlds and had made a choice that seemed reasonable at the time? But even as he tried to form the thoughts, he knew how hollow they sounded. He knew what that photograph showed, what story it told, and he knew that no amount of explanation would change the narrative that had already been written. He was the villain now, the ungrateful son, the man who had sold his soul for status and left his parents to sit in the shadows. "I'll handle it," Io heard himself say, though he had no idea how. "Just give me a few hours. I'll release a statement. I'll fix this." Chidi made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "A few hours? Io, this is everywhere. CNN has picked it up. BBC Africa is covering it. You're trending #1 in Nigeria. You don't have a few hours. You need to do something now." The call ended, and Io stood there in the bathroom holding his dead phone, the fluorescent light harsh against his skin, the mirror showing him a man he barely recognized. Behind him, the bathroom door opened, and Amara stepped in, her hair tousled from sleep, her silk nightgown clinging to her body. She looked at him with concern, her eyes searching his face. "Io, what's wrong? Why are you up so early?" He could not answer, could not find the words. Instead, he held out his phone to her, the Twitter thread still open, the photograph still visible on the screen. Amara took the phone slowly, her movements careful, and as her eyes scanned the image and the comments, Io watched her face change. Watched the confusion give way to understanding, the understanding give way to horror, the horror give way to something else, something harder and colder that he had never seen in her before. She scrolled in silence for what felt like hours, her jaw tight, her breathing controlled, and when she finally looked up at him, there were tears in her eyes, but her voice was steady. "Why did you do this?" she asked, and the question was so simple, so direct, that it cut through all of Io's defenses. "Why did you put them there? Why didn't you let them sit with us?" And Io tried to explain, tried to tell her about the pressure and the expectations and the need to impress her parents, tried to make her see that he had been protecting everyone, including his own parents, from the awkwardness of their differences. But as the words left his mouth, they sounded weak and pathetic even to his own ears, the logic that had seemed so clear last night now revealed as the cowardice it truly was. Amara listened, her face expressionless, and when he finished, she handed him back his phone and said quietly, "My parents didn't need to be impressed by humiliating yours. That's not who I married. That's not who I thought you were." She turned and walked out of the bathroom, leaving Io alone with his reflection and his phone and the crushing weight of what he had done. Outside the window, Lagos was waking up, the city stirring to life with its usual chaos of traffic and voices and endless movement. But inside Io's chest, everything had gone still and cold, a vast emptiness opening up where his confidence had been. He thought of his mother's face last night, the patience in her eyes as she sat at that broken table. He thought of his father's handshake, firm and forgiving even as Io had failed him in the worst possible way. And he thought of the photograph, now seared into the consciousness of millions, a permanent record of his shame, a digital monument to the moment he had chosen status over love, image over integrity, his new life over the people who had given him life itself. The buzzing of his phone resumed, call after call, message after message, the digital world demanding his response, demanding his accountability, demanding his blood. And Io, standing alone in his expensive bathroom, in his expensive house, in his expensive life, finally understood that he had lost something that no amount of money could ever buy back. By noon, Io's world had collapsed entirely. He sat in his home office, the blinds drawn against the Lagos sun, his laptop open before him displaying an inbox that had become a graveyard of professional relationships. First Bank had sent a terse email terminating their software development contract, citing reputational concerns and misalignment of values. MTN followed an hour later with similar language, their 3-year partnership dissolving in a single paragraph of corporate politeness that barely concealed their disgust. The telecommunications company he had spent 2 years courting, the deal he had celebrated just last month with champagne and congratulations, had withdrawn their offer entirely. His assistant had called in tears, saying that protesters had gathered outside the office building in Lekki, young people with handmade signs that read, "Respect your parents," and "Blood over money," and "Shame on TechBridge." The building's management had asked him not to come in until the situation calmed down, their voices tight with the kind of forced diplomacy that meant they wanted nothing to do with him. Io had tried to release a statement, carefully worded by a crisis management consultant he had hired in desperation that morning. The statement expressed regret for any misunderstanding, explained that the seating arrangement had been a logistical oversight, emphasized his love and respect for his parents, and promised to do better. But the internet had shredded it within minutes, dissecting every word for insincerity, mocking the phrase logistical oversight, until it became a trending hashtag filled with sarcastic memes. People posted side-by-side comparisons of the VIP table and the generator corner, asking what kind of logistics would put elderly parents near diesel fumes while feeding oysters to in-laws. A popular blogger wrote an essay titled "The Audacity of Rich Men's Apologies" that went viral, using Io as the primary example of how Nigeria's new elite had lost touch with the values that built the nation. His LinkedIn profile had been flooded with negative reviews, his company's Google rating had dropped to 1 star, and someone had created a Change.org petition demanding that all his business licenses be revoked. The worst part, the part that made Io's hands shake as he stared at his screen, was that he could not argue with them. He could not mount a defense because somewhere in the hurricane of public anger, he had come face to face with the truth of what he had done. He had humiliated his parents. He had valued appearance over love. He had chosen to protect his image at the expense of the 2 people who had sacrificed everything to give him a future. And no amount of corporate language or strategic apologies could change that fundamental betrayal. The photograph did not lie. The broken chair, the shadows, the generator's exhaust, his mother's patient face, his father's sad eyes, all of it was real, all of it was his doing, and all of it had been witnessed now by what felt like the entire nation. Amara had barely spoken to him since that morning. She moved through the house like a ghost, her face composed but her eyes distant, answering his questions with single words, avoiding his touch when he reached for her. Her mother had called 3 times, and each conversation had ended with Amara walking away with tears streaming down her face. Io did not need to hear the words to know what was being said. Mrs. Nwasu was disappointed, perhaps disgusted, certainly questioning her daughter's choice in marrying a man capable of such cruelty. And Amara, caught between her husband and her family, was drowning in the middle, her loyalties torn, her own shame at having been part of that evening visible in the way she could not meet Io's eyes. In the afternoon, Chidi came to the house. Io's business partner looked exhausted, his usually neat appearance disheveled, his shirt wrinkled and his tie loosened. He sat across from Io in the living room and spoke in the flat, emotionless tone of someone delivering terrible news that had already been processed and accepted. The board of directors had called an emergency meeting. The investors were threatening to pull their funding. 2 senior developers had resigned, citing hostile work environment and ethical concerns. The company's social media accounts had been flooded with so much vitriol that they had been forced to disable comments and go private. Banks were reconsidering their loan agreements. The office landlord was exploring options to terminate the lease early. Everything they had built over 5 years, every client they had won, every reputation they had earned, was evaporating in real time, burned away by the heat of public outrage. "They want you to step down," Chidi said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "The board, the investors, everyone, they think it's the only way to save the company. If you resign as CEO and remove yourself from all public-facing roles, we might be able to salvage something, might be able to convince some clients to stay, might be able to rebuild." Io had known this was coming, had felt it approaching like a train in the distance, but hearing the words spoken aloud still hit him with the force of a physical blow. Step down, remove himself, disappear from the company he had founded, the business he had poured his entire adult life into, the thing he had sacrificed everything to build. "And if I don't?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Chidi looked at him with something that might have been pity or might have been relief. "Then the company dies. Everything dies, and it won't just be you who suffers. It'll be the 43 people we employ, their families, their futures. It'll be all of us." The choice was not really a choice at all, and they both knew it. Io signed the resignation papers that evening, his signature shaky, his vision blurred by tears he refused to let fall. He transferred his shares to a trust, removed his name from the company website, drafted an internal memo announcing his departure. Chidi left just after sunset, his goodbye brief and awkward, the friendship they had shared for years now strained beyond recognition by the weight of what Io had cost them both. And when Amara came home from wherever she had spent the day, she found Io sitting in the dark living room, no lights on, no television playing, just him and the silence and the ruins of everything he had worked for. She sat down beside him, not touching but present, and they stayed that way for a long time. Finally she spoke, her voice soft and tired. "My father called. He said we should consider going away for a while, letting things cool down, maybe travel abroad, wait until people forget." Io turned to look at her, seeing in the dim light from the window the exhaustion etched into her beautiful face. "Do you want that?" he asked. "Do you want to run?" Amara was quiet for a moment, her hands folded in her lap, her breathing measured. "I don't know what I want anymore," she admitted. "I thought I knew who you were. I thought I understood what kind of man I married. But that photograph, Io, seeing your parents like that, knowing you put them there, I keep trying to reconcile it with the man I love, and I can't." The words should have hurt, but Io was beyond pain now, beyond the capacity to feel anything but a vast and empty shame. "I need to go see them," he said, the realization settling over him with the weight of inevitability. "I need to go home, to the village. I need to apologize." Amara nodded slowly, as if she had expected this, as if she too had known that there was no way forward without first going back. "Then we'll go," she said, and the pronoun surprised him, gave him a small spark of something that might have been hope. "Together?" he asked, his voice breaking on the word. "Together," she confirmed, though her tone carried no warmth, only resignation. "Because despite everything, despite how angry and confused and hurt I am, you're still my husband. And if you're going to face this, you're not going to do it alone." The decision was made then, in that dark living room, with the weight of public judgment pressing down on them like the Lagos heat. They would leave the city. They would return to Io's village in Enugu State, to the place he had spent years trying to escape, to the humble compound where his parents still lived without running water or reliable electricity. They would face what he had done, face the people he had betrayed, and somehow, impossibly, try to find a way back to the man he used to be before money and status had twisted him into someone unrecognizable. Io spent the next 2 days settling affairs, closing accounts, making arrangements. He sold the Mercedes, needing the money now that his income had disappeared. He called his landlord about breaking the lease on their apartment in Ikoyi, enduring the man's cold disapproval and expensive penalties. He packed their belongings, choosing what could come and what would have to be left behind, each decision a small letting go of the life he had built. Amara moved through the process mechanically, helping where needed but maintaining her emotional distance, a barrier Io did not know how to cross. Her parents had stopped calling, a silence that spoke volumes about their disappointment. His own phone had gone quiet too, the flood of angry messages finally subsiding into a kind of collective dismissal, as if the internet had decided he was no longer worth their attention, no longer worth even their outrage. On the morning they were scheduled to leave Lagos, Io stood on the balcony of their apartment and looked out over the city that had been his home for a decade. The glass towers of Victoria Island glinted in the distance, the chaotic beauty of Lagos spreading out in every direction like a living organism. He had come here with nothing, had fought and clawed and worked until he had made a place for himself among the elite, had convinced himself that he belonged in this world of money and power and status. But standing there now, preparing to leave it all behind, he realized that he had never truly belonged. He had only been playing a part, wearing a costume, pretending to be someone he was not. And in the process of becoming that pretend person, he had lost sight of the real one, the boy from the village who had been raised to value family above all else, who had been taught that respect was earned through character, not wealth, who had known in his bones that honor meant standing with your people regardless of how they looked or where they came from. The drive to Enugu State took 7 hours, the roads growing progressively worse as they left the paved highways of Lagos and entered the red dirt paths of the countryside. Io drove in silence, his hands tight on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Amara sat beside him, watching the landscape change outside her window, the modern city giving way to small towns and villages, corrugated iron roofs replacing glass facades, roadside markets replacing shopping malls. This was her first time in Io's village, the first time she would see where he had come from, and he could feel her tension, her uncertainty about what awaited them. As they crossed into Enugu State and the hills began to rise around them, green and lush in the afternoon light, Io felt something shift inside him, some tightly wound spring beginning to loosen. The air smelled different here, cleaner and earthier, carrying the scent of rain and red soil and growing things. This was home. Not the apartment in Ikoyi or the office in Lekki, but this place, these roads, this land. And somewhere ahead, in a small compound surrounded by cassava farms and palm trees, his parents were waiting. They arrived at the village just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that seemed to set the world on fire. The compound looked exactly as Io remembered it from his childhood, a small collection of buildings with faded paint and rusting zinc roofs, surrounded by a low fence that needed repair. His father's yam barn stood to one side, its thatched roof sagging slightly, and behind it stretched the cassava farm where Io had worked as a boy, his hands blistered from the hoe, his back aching from bending in the sun. The main house was modest, 3 rooms with cement floors and walls that his father had built himself over the course of several years, adding 1 room at a time as money allowed. There was no gate, no security, no pretense of grandeur. Just a home, simple and honest, where 2 old people had raised their son with love and sacrifice and dreams of a better future. Io parked the car under the shade of a mango tree, the same tree he had climbed as a child, and for a long moment he could not bring himself to open the door. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, a drumbeat of fear and shame and desperate hope. What would he say to them? How could he possibly explain what he had done? How could he ask for forgiveness when he did not deserve it? Beside him, Amara reached over and placed her hand on his arm, a small gesture that carried more weight than words. "You have to do this," she said softly, and there was something in her voice that had not been there since the morning after the dinner, a thread of warmth, a hint of the woman who had loved him before everything fell apart. "Whatever happens, you have to face it." Io nodded, unable to speak, and opened the car door, stepping out into the dusty compound where the air smelled of wood smoke and earth and all the memories of his youth. His mother saw him first. She was sitting on a low stool near the house, peeling cassava with practiced hands, and when she looked up and recognized him standing there in the fading light, her face went through a series of emotions too quick to name. Surprise, joy, confusion, and then something more guarded, more cautious, as if she were bracing herself for another blow. She stood slowly, setting down her knife in the cassava, wiping her hands on her wrapper, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the dusty yard. Io felt his throat close up, felt tears burning behind his eyes, and he wanted to run to her, to fall at her feet and beg her forgiveness, but his legs would not move. He was frozen there, paralyzed by the enormity of what he had done to her, by the memory of her sitting at that broken table in the shadows, while he laughed and drank at the center of the room. "Mama," he managed to say, his voice cracking on the single word, and that was all it took. She crossed the distance between them in quick, shuffling steps, her small frame moving with surprising speed, and she wrapped her arms around him with a strength that belied her size. She smelled the way she had always smelled, like palm oil and firewood in safety, and Io felt something break inside him, the carefully constructed dam of his composure giving way all at once. He sobbed into her shoulder, his whole body shaking, years of pretending and performing and protecting his image dissolving in the face of her simple, unconditional embrace. "I'm sorry," he choked out between sobs. "Mama, I'm so sorry. What I did to you, what I did to Papa, I'm so sorry." She held him tighter, her hand patting his back the way she had done when he was a child waking from nightmares, and she made soft, shushing sounds, her own voice thick with tears. "Hush now, my son, hush. You are home. That is what matters. You are home." Behind her, Io's father emerged from the house, moving slowly, his body bent with age and work, but his eyes still sharp and assessing. Papa Akaffer took in the scene before him, his son weeping in his mother's arms, the expensive car under the tree, Amara standing uncertainly nearby, and his face remained carefully neutral, revealing nothing. He was not a man who gave his emotions freely, had never been one to speak when silence would do, but there was something in the set of his shoulders, in the way he held himself, that told Io the wound had gone deep. When Mama finally released Io from her embrace, stepping back to wipe her own tears with the edge of her wrapper, Papa came forward and extended his hand, just his hand. A simple, formal gesture that carried the weight of judgment withheld, of forgiveness not yet granted, but not refused either. Io took his father's hand and felt the familiar calluses, the rough skin that spoke of decades of farming, and he could not bear the formality of it, could not stand the distance implied by that handshake. He pulled his father into an embrace despite the old man's stiffness, despite the way Papa's arms remained at his sides for several long seconds before slowly, reluctantly, coming up to pat Io's back with awkward, uncertain movements. "Papa, I am sorry," Io whispered against his father's thin shoulder. "I dishonored you, I shamed you, I failed you in every way a son can fail his father. Please forgive me." Papa Akaffer was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was gruff with emotion carefully controlled. "You forgot us, Io. You forgot where you came from. You forgot what we taught you about respect and family. Money changed you into someone we did not recognize." The words were like knives, each one cutting deep, but Io knew he deserved them, knew they were true. "I know, Papa, I know." His father pulled back then, holding Io at arm's length, studying his face with those penetrating eyes that had always seemed able to see through deception to truth. "Why did you come back?" he asked, and the question was genuine, not accusatory, as if he truly wanted to understand what had brought his son to this moment. Io swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet his father's gaze despite the shame burning in his chest. "I lost everything, Papa. The business, the reputation, the life I built in Lagos. All of it gone because of what I did to you and Mama at that dinner. The whole nation saw it, judged me for it, and they were right to judge. I came back because I have nowhere else to go. But more than that, I came back because I need to learn how to be the man you raised me to be. I need to remember who I was before money made me forget." Papa Akaffer considered this, his weathered face unreadable, and then he nodded slowly, more to himself than to Io. "Come inside," he said finally. "Both of you. It will be dark soon, and your wife must be tired from the journey." He turned and walked back toward the house, his gait slow but steady, and Mama touched Io's arm gently before following her husband. Io looked back at Amara, who had been standing silently throughout the entire exchange, witnessing his breakdown, his apology, his father's measured response. She looked different here in the village compound, out of place in her designer jeans and carefully applied makeup, but her eyes were soft with something that might have been understanding, or might have been pity, or might have been the first stirrings of restored love. The days that followed were unlike anything Io had experienced in years. He woke each morning with the roosters, the sound jarring after years of waking to alarm clocks and traffic noise. He worked alongside his father in the cassava farm, learning again the rhythm of the hoe and the feel of red earth under his feet. His hands, soft from years of typing on keyboards and shaking hands in air-conditioned offices, developed blisters that burst and bled and eventually hardened into calluses. His back ached from bending in the sun, his shoulders burned from exposure to the elements, and every night he fell into bed exhausted in a way that was completely different from the mental exhaustion of running a company. This was the tiredness of honest physical labor, the kind that cleared the mind and quieted the endless noise of ambition and anxiety that had driven him for so long. Amara struggled at first, unused to village life, uncomfortable with the lack of running water and reliable electricity, uncertain how to navigate a world so different from the one she had grown up in. But Mama took her under her wing with the same gentle patience she had shown Io as a child, teaching her how to draw water from the well, how to light a coal pot for cooking, how to grind pepper with stones, how to wash clothes by hand and hang them on lines strung between trees. Io watched his wife transform slowly, saw her designer clothes give way to simple wrappers and blouses, saw her carefully maintained nails chip and break from work, saw her perfect hair gather dust and sun until she tied it back in a simple scarf like the village women wore. And in the transformation, he saw something else emerge, something that had perhaps always been there beneath the polish and the privilege, a strength, a resilience, a willingness to adapt that he had never fully appreciated. The villagers knew about the scandal, of course. News traveled even here, carried by phones and radios and the ever-present gossip network that connected every Nigerian community regardless of distance. Some people stared at Io when he walked through the village market, their eyes carrying judgment or curiosity or schadenfreude. Others avoided him entirely, crossing to the other side of the dusty road rather than exchange greetings. But his parents' neighbors, the people who had known Io since childhood, treated him with a kind of firm kindness, acknowledging his presence without condemnation, but also without pretending that nothing had happened. They let him work his way back into their good graces through actions rather than words, through showing up and laboring alongside them, through proving that he was willing to humble himself and relearn the values they all shared. One evening about 3 weeks after their arrival, Io sat with his father on the veranda as the sun set, both of them tired from a day in the fields, both silent in the comfortable way of men who have worked together. Papa finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of wisdom earned through 7 decades of life. "You know, my son, when you were born, your mother and I had nothing, less than nothing. Debts from the hospital, no money for food, only this small piece of land and our determination to survive. We could have despaired. We could have given up, but we looked at you, this small life we had brought into the world, and we made a promise. We promised that you would have opportunities we never had, that you would go to school and make something of yourself, that you would rise above the poverty that had trapped our own parents and their parents before them." He paused, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun was turning the sky crimson. "We kept that promise. We sold our goats to pay your school fees. We went without food so you could eat. We wore rags so you could have a uniform. And when you won that scholarship to the university, we wept with joy because we knew we had succeeded. We knew you would have the better life we had dreamed of for you." Papa turned then to look at Io directly, his eyes clear and honest and carrying no malice, only sadness. "But somewhere along the way, you forgot that the purpose of rising was not to leave us behind. It was to bring us with you, to honor the sacrifice that made your success possible, to remember that your achievements were built on our backs and our love. When you put us at that table near the generator, you did not just humiliate us. You rejected everything we had taught you about family, about respect, about the African values that say parents are to be honored above all others." Io felt tears streaming down his face, but he did not wipe them away, did not try to hide them. "I know, Papa," he said, his voice breaking. "I know, and I can never take it back. I can never undo the pain I caused you and Mama. All I can do is spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you again, trying to prove that I remember now, that I understand what matters." His father reached over and placed his rough, calloused hand over Io's, a gesture of connection, of forgiveness slowly taking root. "Then prove it," Papa said simply, "not with words or money or grand gestures, but by living here, by working here, by being the son who sits at our table and eats our food and shares our life without shame, without thinking he is too good for the place that made him. Prove it by teaching your own children one day that success means nothing if you forget the hands that raised you." The months passed, measured not in quarterly earnings or client meetings, but in planting seasons and harvest times, in the slow transformation of cassava tubers into flour, in the daily rhythms of village life that had remained unchanged for generations. Io's body changed, becoming leaner and stronger, his soft businessman's physique replaced by the wiry muscle of someone who worked the land. His mind changed too, quieting, slowing, learning again to find satisfaction in simple things, a good day's work, a meal shared with family, the sound of rain on a zinc roof, the sight of crops growing strong in red soil. The constant anxiety that had driven him in Lagos, the endless hunger for more success, more recognition, more wealth, faded gradually until he could barely remember what it had felt like to live that way. Amara changed as well, perhaps even more dramatically than Io. The woman who had grown up with housekeepers and drivers learned to cook over an open fire and wash clothes in a metal basin and carry water balanced on her head the way village women did. She formed a quiet friendship with Io's mother, the two of them working side by side in the kitchen or the garden, and Io would sometimes catch them laughing together over some small joke, their heads bent close, and he would feel his heart swell with a gratitude so profound it left him breathless. His wife had not left him. Despite everything, despite the shame and the loss and the dramatic change in circumstances, she had chosen to stay, to stand beside him as he rebuilt himself from the ground up. One afternoon, nearly 6 months after their return to the village, Io was working in the yam barn when he heard his father calling him. He emerged into the sunlight, wiping sweat from his face, and found Papa standing in the compound with a small group of village elders, men of his father's generation who served as the informal council that governed community affairs. They had come, Papa explained, because they wanted to discuss something with Io. The men sat under the mango tree, and Io joined them, his heart uncertain about what this meeting might mean. The eldest among them, a man called Chief Obi who must have been 90 years old, spoke in the measured tones of someone accustomed to being heard. Io, son of Akafar, he began, we have watched you these past months. We have seen you work the land, humble yourself, learn again the ways of your people. We have seen that you are not the man in that photograph anymore, the man who forgot his parents and chased after status like a dog chasing its tail. You have come home, truly home, not just in body but in spirit. The other elders nodded, their faces grave but not unkind. Chief Obi continued, the village has a problem. Our young people are starting an agricultural cooperative, trying to use modern methods to improve our farming, but they need someone who understands both the old ways and the new ways. Someone who knows the land but also knows business and technology. They need a teacher, a guide. We think that person might be you if you are willing. Io looked at his father, who was watching him with an expression that might have been pride, and then at the elders, these men who represented everything he had once tried to escape and had now come to respect more than anything in the world he had left behind. The old Io would have seen this as beneath him, a step backward, a waste of his education and skills. But the new Io, the man who had been rebuilt in the red soil of his ancestors, saw it for what it truly was, an opportunity to serve, to give back, to use everything he had learned not for his own glory but for the good of his community. I would be honored, he said, his voice steady and sure. I would be honored to serve the village in any way I can. That night after the elders had left and the evening meal had been shared, Io sat with Amara on the veranda watching the stars emerge in a sky unpolluted by city lights. She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence for a long time. Finally she spoke, her voice soft in the darkness. I'm proud of you, she said. I'm proud of who you've become here, of the man you're choosing to be. This isn't the life I imagined when I married you, but it's a good life. It's an honest life, and I think maybe it's a better life than the one we had before. Io kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair, which now smelled of wood smoke and shea butter instead of expensive perfume. I love you, he whispered. Thank you for staying. Thank you for not giving up on me when I had given up on myself. The scandal eventually faded from public consciousness, replaced by newer outrages and fresher scandals, the way all viral moments eventually dissolve into the endless stream of digital content. Io's name stopped trending, the articles stopped being written, and the photograph that had destroyed his old life became just another forgotten image in the vast archive of the internet. But Io never forgot it. He kept a copy of it on his phone, not as a source of shame, but as a reminder, a permanent record of the moment he had lost his way and the journey back that had followed. Sometimes, late at night, he would look at it and remember the man he had been, the man in the expensive suit laughing at the VIP table while his parents sat forgotten in the shadows. And then he would look around at the simple room where he now slept, at his wife beside him, at the life they were building here in the village, and he would understand that losing everything had been the greatest gift he had ever received. Years later, when Io's first child was born, a son with his mother's eyes and his father's chin, Papa Akafar held the baby in his weathered arms and wept openly, tears streaming down his face as he whispered blessings in Igbo over the infant's head. And when it came time for the naming ceremony, held not in a five-star hotel but under the mango tree in the family compound, with the whole village invited and no distinction made between rich and poor, VIP and common, Io stood before everyone he loved and everyone who loved him, and he told the story. He told the story of his shame, his fall, his return, his redemption. He told it honestly, sparing no detail, hiding nothing, because he wanted his son to grow up knowing that success was meaningless without character, that wealth was worthless without integrity, that no achievement in the world mattered if you forgot the people who made you possible. This child, Io said, holding his son up for all to see, will know his grandparents. He will sit at their table with pride. He will learn from their wisdom and honor their sacrifice. He will understand that family is not something you leave behind when you rise, it is what you rise for. And as the villagers cheered and ululated and the celebration began, Io looked at his parents sitting in places of honor at the center of everything, his mother's face glowing with joy, his father's eyes bright with tears, and he finally understood what his father had tried to teach him all along, that the only table that mattered was the one where your loved ones were welcome, where respect was given freely, where love was the currency that counted. That true success was not measured in bank accounts or business contracts or status symbols, but in the faces of the people who knew you at your worst and loved you anyway, who forgave your failures and celebrated your redemptions, who held you accountable and held you close in equal measure. Io had lost everything to learn this lesson: his company, his reputation, his wealth, his place in the world of Lagos elite. But in losing everything, he had found something infinitely more valuable. He had found his way home. He had found himself. He had found the truth that would guide him for the rest of his days, that the hands that raised you deserve a seat at every table of your life, and that honoring them is not a burden but a privilege, not a shame but a glory, not a step backward but the only way to truly move forward.